Thank you for joining us for part one of the Effective Weed Management Consideration series. My name is Drew Walter, Pest Management Senior Specialist with the Almond Board of California. Here's a brief outline of what I'll be discussing today. As you can see here, the overarching theme is integrated weed management. Then I'll move into weed management consideration for young orchards and some of the precautions, which hopefully will lead us to asking ourselves, what are our goals with orchard floor weed management? So integrated weed management. This is generally composed of 5 components. As you could see here, one is missing, which I will get into at the end of this slide. Mechanical control. This can include anything from hand pulling, tillage, burning, which is also known as flaming, mowing, and some of the other exciting emerging technologies in our industry, which include anywhere from superheated air to the electrostatic control of weeds. Then there's the cultural component, which can include anything from the use of cover crops to compete against weeds, berming your tree rows, and keeping weeds in ditches and canals under control. Then there's the chemical component of this, which I've included some of the application stewardship guidelines. So perhaps one of the most important things here is proper weed identification. This allows you to be aware of which herbicide-resistant species are prevalent in your region or in your orchard in specific. Then there's the use of tank mixes with different modes of action. Why tank mixes? Using a combination of products with different modes of action not only broadens the range of weeds controlled in a single application, but also reduces the risk of selecting for herbicide resistance and or tolerance in your orchard. Then we move into the 4 R's, which are the right time, right place, right rate, and rotate. Make sure to rotate the modes of action to avoid herbicide resistance. Then we move into the basis of any good integrated weed management program, which is prevention. So prevention can include anything from avoiding contamination. Now, what I mean for this, for example, is if you get compost delivered, make sure the compost has been properly cured to avoid the introduction of any new seed or weed species in your orchard. Then we move into avoid spreading. Now, what I mean by this is make sure you clean your equipment if you're moving from orchard to orchard to avoid any sort of ride-alongs that might move from one orchard that just got managed into the next. Then we move into the control of weeds before they go to seed. The idea here is that you want to reduce that seed bank in your orchard and not have a seed bank that builds year in and year out that you have to manage over and over again. Then again, one of the most important components of prevention is weed scouting, which I'll get into in the next slide. But first, there's that biological component. Biological component in an integrated weed management system for perennial orchards is underutilized. But this can include anything from the use of goats or sheep to manage the weeds in tree rows and berms. So now weed scouting. Scouting for weeds, again, is the basis for a good integrated weed management plan. While weeds are present in every orchard, there's variation in weed species phenology, composition, and density. For example, an orchard in its third leaf will have a greater amount of sunlight hitting the orchard floor compared to a mature orchard, affecting the species composition of weeds prevalent in each of these orchards. Next, weed scouting will allow you to figure out what are the most prevalent species in your orchard and also target them before they get to a mature state. Most weed species are much more challenging to manage as they mature. For example, there's this species on the right, a malva species, in its immature state. Easy to control through mechanical applications or through chemical applications. If you allow it to get to its mature state, neither mechanical or chemical is easy to manage. It's easy to use or manage the species. Scouting should be done at the start of the season and at post-harvest. I'll provide a tool in the next slide that will help you have a protocol for how to properly scout an orchard. And again, this allows for monitoring of herbicide resistance. While you're scouting, you could really see what parts of your orchard you have a higher incidence or severity of weed species infestations, and where maybe some of the management programs that you've had selected for that year were selecting for herbicide resistance. For more information on which species are herbicide resistant in California, Google the current status of herbicide resistance in California. There you will find a document by Lynn Sosnowski, formerly a UCCE Cooperative Extension Farm Advisor in Merced and now with Cornell, where she's provided a list of all the herbicide resistant species in California, updated in 2019. Here's the helpful tool I was talking about. So visit the UCIPM website under the almond production category. Scroll down to the weeds section and select integrated weed management. Here you will see at the bottom a late fall and a late spring weed survey. If you select survey your orchard, you'll see this document here that not only provides you step-by-step guides on how to properly scout, but it also lists some of the most common species, whether it's annual or perennial, that are prevalent in the Central Valley. It would be a good idea to highlight which species are herbicide resistant before going out to scout so that you can be aware of which ones are prevalent in your area. So proper weed identification. Accurately identifying weed species is crucial for the effective management because herbicide recommendations, mechanical and cultural control strategies vary depending on species. While some species can look similar, they may have drastically different management requirements. For example, the two images on the left show two different goosegrass species that can look similar in the field. So you can see here, this is Eleusine indica versus Eleusine tristachia, but they both differ in phenology and control strategies. One is an annual and one is a perennial. Here's the annual goosegrass versus the perennial three-spike goosegrass. Now, what this means is that mowing will only invigorate the perennial species, while it will provide control of the annual species shown down here on the left. Now, the image here on the right shows field bindweed, Convolvulus arvensis. Understanding the phenology of this species is key to achieving control. Mowing can lead to the exponential growth of this rhizomatous species, and improper timing of chemical applications yields poor results. Now, the trick here is targeting the species at post-bloom, late in the season. This will ensure that systemic herbicides translocate to the extensive root system and manage the species. Here's the helpful tool for proper weed identification in your orchard. Again, visit the UCIPM website for almond production, scroll down to the weeds section, and select common and scientific names of weeds. Here you will find a robust list of herbicide or of weeds in your orchard that will give detailed identification of each species, both the common names and the scientific names. Now, management in young orchards. So weed management in young orchards can be challenging. Now, why is this? Young trees often are more susceptible to herbicide damage. Several different annual and broadleaf species need to be controlled. Now, this is because of what I mentioned earlier. There's more sunlight hitting the orchard floor, meaning you have a greater species composition that can be available in that orchard. There are fewer herbicides available for use in young orchards compared to mature orchards. Now, this is just because of the susceptibility, which I'll get into in the next slide. The susceptibility of these young trees ranges from anywhere from pre-emergence to post-emergence susceptibility. In my opinion, cover crops are often overlooked when establishing young orchards. Here you'll see on an image on the right, a young orchard without cover crops, and you can start to see the spread of weeds. And of course, here's the irrigation system where it provides moistures both in the tree rows and the middles, where weed species will start to germinate. Now, if you use cover crops, you use that competitive advantage of having a cover crop planting to outcompete the weeds. So here's some young orchard precautions. Remember that tree crops are not resistant to herbicides. Crop safety is usually achieved by proper application, and I'll get into that in a bit. But first, after planting, tree roots are shallow and soil is still settling, which means soil applied herbicides can settle or run into loosely packed pockets and cracks in the soil. Make sure soil is settled before applying herbicide and manage water carefully to avoid moving herbicides deeply into the soil. Branches in young trees are lower and more likely to get hit by drift. Be extra cautious with windy conditions, spray rig height, nozzle angle, and nozzle selection. Green trunk wood is often still susceptible to contact and systemic herbicides. Leave cartons on the trunks for the first 2 years after planting or until the trunk diameter gets too large. Now, what I mean by this is at about the second leaf going into the third leaf, the trunk diameter is going to push out of that carton and break it off. The best idea and the best plan here is to make sure you allow enough time once you take off that carton to let the tree trunk harden off. Now here in this image on the right, you could see here's the eastern and western side, both where the rig came through with herbicides and hit the tree trunk. Now this darker range here is where the herbicide actually hit and formed some necrotic tissue, while any part where herbicides did not hit this young trunk, you still see some green live tissue. Here's some helpful tips for herbicide information, which include anywhere from susceptibility of weeds in almond orchards. Now, this will provide you either young orchard or mature orchard guidelines, and also provides an herbicide treatment table. So here's the susceptibility of weeds in almonds. As you can see here, this is going to provide you a list of pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides, and then which species are susceptible to which products. That way you can kind of plan out your mode of actions and which ones you're going to use as you rotate year in and year out. Now, hopefully what this did as we walked through this slide deck is that we looked at what precautions to take, what are the considerations in terms of an integrated weed management system. Hopefully this led us also to think about what are our goals in thinking of orchard weed management. And in our next presentation by Dr. Brad Hansen, he'll get further into detail with this. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining part 1. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. My information's down here on the left. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Brad Hansen. I'm a Cooperative Extension Weed Science Specialist at UC Davis. And as part of a program today, I want to talk a little bit about effective weed management considerations. So the problem, this is sort of a three-way tug of war, and sometimes it feels a bit like this four-way tug of war. I think where we're in the middle, getting pulled in every direction as orchard managers. So just the way that I think about herbicides, I'm going to focus on herbicides for the sustainability kind of weed management sustainability part of this program. But the way that I think about this is we manage weeds in almonds a lot of different ways in the state. You can see a couple of examples here that I've pulled out of my files. Relatively low herbicide intensity. You can see this wintertime almond orchard. I think that was in the Merced area a few years ago. A lot of what I see in the winter and springtime looks like that middle photo where we've got fairly intense chemical programs in the strips and maybe less intense chemical programs or maybe physical only in the middles. And then in some orchards year-round, I see them looking like that right-hand photo. And certainly we see most of our orchards look like that ahead of harvest because of our harvest operations. But I feel like this represents a spectrum of weed management, herbicide weed management intensity in the almond orchard system. So the questions that I would like to think about in terms of weed management considerations and maybe where we have opportunities to reduce the herbicide intensity are listed here. First and foremost, what weeds do I have in the orchard? This is something I talk about in pretty much every extension opportunity is making sure that as weed managers, we know what we're trying to manage. If we don't really understand the weed species or group of species that are in the orchard, it's really hard to design and implement effective weed management strategies. And a lot of times I see failures of weed management programs really as failures of weed ID. We've implemented a program that just wasn't the right one for the problem we're trying to resolve. Next, once we've identified the weeds and have some idea of the weed spectrum that are in that orchard, I think it's really important to ask ourselves which of these are actual production problems. And that may vary dramatically in different orchard ages as well. But not all weeds are created equally. Some are much more problematic, and some are probably more uh, much less of a problem in terms of a production issue. Sort of the next step in that really is thinking about my tolerance for weeds. And I may have different tolerance for weeds in the tree rows or strips than I do in the middles. And I think it's really important to ask yourself that question, because I would put out there that I think we do a lot of overtreatment in the almond production system. So once we've talked about what weeds we have, what our tolerance for those weeds is, we need to think about what our control options are. And we have different control options in the strips, perhaps, than we do in the middles, particularly with regard to physical weed control, which is certainly much more easily done in the middles than it is in the tree rows. And then lastly, I'd like to bring this back around to what can I do? What tools do I have to reduce my weed control intensity? That could be spatially or chronologically over the course of the year. If our goal is to reduce the amount of herbicides or total pesticides in that almond orchard, we can do that at a couple of different ways, both the scale that we're using it in any given application or the number of applications that are done during the course of the year. And then I think my overall, you know, thinking, process or thought process here is, can we move towards our almond production system sustainability goals with minimal impacts on actual weed control efficiency and the production system efficiency, with minimal impact on production and hopefully a benefit to the economic component of this. So I won't belabor this because you've probably all seen this slide before, but weed ID and field scouting is really important, because we need to know what it is that we need to really describe and understand what the problem is before we can design effective management strategies. No technique, herbicide or otherwise, controls all weeds. Um, and not all weeds, as I said earlier, not all weeds are equally damaging to the production system. And even within species, there can be differences in how they respond to control strategies, particularly thinking about herbicide-resistant weeds in this case. So there's a lot of tools out there to help you identify weeds, whether they're online tools like in the lower right, or weed ID books and manuals and or even smartphone apps are getting better and better in terms of weed ID. So get some idea of what weed you're trying to control so that you have some sense of the biology of that weed, when it emerges, when it produces seed and senesces, and that will help you make decisions about timing your control strategies and other interventions more appropriately. So just two examples here in thinking about how problematic is a specific weed that could be commonly found in an almond orchard. And then thinking about, do we need to expend the same level of effort and expense to control every weed out there? Just two examples, common grasses we see in orchard systems: annual bluegrass or Poa annua, and Johnson grass or sorghum halopense. So annual bluegrass, people are very familiar with this. It's an annual, one might guess from the name. This is a winter weed, so it's germinating, now, November, December, January in our area, most of our almond production areas. Typically completes its life cycle by mid-spring, April, probably May. It's a low growing, short statured plant. It's an annual grass, so the residue isn't very persistent. I would describe annual bluegrass as not generally a very big problem in terms of our production system, the almond production system. And maybe that's one where we can tolerate a little bit more weed presence in the almond orchard without going to the effort and expense of a chemical intervention. On the other hand, a weed like Johnson grass, that's a perennial species. It's uh, germinates in the spring and grows through the summer, so it's actively growing when our almonds are growing. It's a large stature plant. Those plants can be 2-3 feet tall. Has a clumping habit, so the residue is fairly persistent, and that can be a problem from our harvest efficiency. As a perennial, this one reproduces by seeds, but more problematic is it has short creeping rhizomes, so it can spread from vegetative propagules. So this is one that I think is a much more competitive weed. I mean, that seems fairly obvious. This is one we want to probably spend more time controlling, especially in young orchards, because of its competitive ability during the growing season of the crop. On the other hand, this is one that's a really it needs a lot of sunlight, so we don't tend to see Johnson grass as a big problem once we have established almond orchards. So early intervention could be really important for this weed, and quite a bit different than the annual bluegrass that I just made the comparison to. So in addition to what are the weeds, I think where are the weeds is a good another good question to ask yourself as you're designing and implementing control strategies. Depending on where they are, just like real estate, weeds location is important. Um, Weeds right near the tree, especially young trees, are much more problematic. They can be more competitive because they're right in the immediate root zone of that young tree. Um, but weeds, on the other hand, weeds out in the middle of drive rows of an established orchard probably have little, if any, actual impact on the productivity of that system. In addition, weeds out in the middles are much more easily controlled later on, with mowing and tillage or whatever other kind of strategies might be implemented. So essentially, the closer the weeds are to the crop or to the irrigation system, the much more difficult they are to control, and the more important it is to control them. And I would say, speaking specifically about irrigation systems, in addition to direct competition with the small young almond trees, weeds that interfere with irrigation system operation, if they have any moving parts or just with spray patterns that would potentially limit where the water goes, that could actually have a secondary impact on the crop, those are weeds you want to spend some time and effort to control. So back to timing, I would just make the comment, understanding something about the specific weeds growth patterns is really important. When it germinates, when it's growing rapidly and using the most resources, and then of course also when it produces seed. This is when you can time control strategies to get your pre-emergent herbicides on the field before the germination starts while you have a chance for it to work. Post-emergent herbicides generally work better on smaller plants, so you don't want to wait till they're way too big, where your control, especially with contact herbicides, is much likely to be substandard. And you also don't want to time your control strategies after they've set seed. Mowing uh, senescing Italian ryegrass doesn't really do you much good. It makes you feel better, but you've already returned thousands and thousands of seed per square meter, probably in a heavy infestation. So timing of all of those control strategies is highly dependent on uh, the growth pattern of the weed species in the orchard. And then just one more comment about seed production. I already talked about late mowing being detrimental from a weed seed bank standpoint, but this is something we might manipulate in a cover crop system. For example, if there are species that we want to produce seed, we may manipulate the timing of that mowing operation to allow cover crop to set seed and then mow it, so that we've got return seed for that um, for next year, for the subsequent season. So in terms of thinking about where we can reduce herbicide intensity, I like to think about sort of what levers do we have that we could pull or push to enact some kind of change. I'm going to go through. Well, I'll go through these all, and then I'll touch on them again individually. But the first lever that I see is, what herbicide products are we using? Is this the best product or products for the job at hand? So that comes back to understanding of the weeds in the orchard, understanding of what the goals are, and really putting herbicides in the tank that will do the best job, the, uh, you know for the given cost and goals of that orchard. Next is thinking about the rates. What rates are they being applied at? Could we achieve the same level of weed control with a lower rate? I see fairly often top of the label rates used because that's quote unquote better. You're going to get better weed control if you use as much as you can. And that's true to a degree. Um, but I think there are some cases where we overtreat. I had a colleague once who, describing a different pest, said, you can only kill this pest one time. A higher rate doesn't make it any deader. And I think that's pretty true. If we could get effective weed control with a lower rate rather than the higher rate, we should think about using the lower rate. Are there products that could be used at lower rates and replace a higher rate product? And that's one way, depending on how you define and enumerate sustainability goals. Reducing pounds of AI or quarts or grams or whatever is one way that we could be working towards those less pesticide use goals. So rather than something that's used at pounds per acre or kilos per hectare, maybe there's something that's similarly effective at grams per acre. um, Next, how frequently are herbicides used in that orchard? I'll come back to this in a minute, but this is over the last few years, I've spent a lot of time thinking about pre-emergent herbicides. One of my goals, and I think an industry goal with pre-herbicides, is to get effective weed control with residual herbicides so that we don't have to keep spraying those same orchards with post-emergent materials. So a product that can give several months of control and eliminate one or two post-emergent herbicide applications might be a way to work towards these sustainability goals. I think this also goes into the slightly relaxed threshold perspective as well. I will come back to that in just a minute, because I do think, at least fairly regularly, I end up in an orchard where another application was made because there was a few weeds present. And I'm not really sure it's always worthwhile economically or from a sustainability standpoint to do a herbicide application to control, you know, very, very scattered weeds. In some cases, that might be important because of what that species is, and you want to nip a new problem in the bud. But I think in many cases we could change our threshold just a little bit and reduce a few applications. Next, how many, basically how wide is the strip? We enumerate herbicide use. You guys report this to CDPR on sprayed acres, not orchard acres. And that basically has to do with what proportion of the orchard is being treated with any given application. And I'll just do one little, mental exercise here. If we reduce the width of a spray strip from 10 feet down to 8 feet, assuming a 22-foot row spacing, that would be a 9% reduction in sprayed acres for that application. And so, with a relatively small change in, herbicide strip width, we can, we make big steps towards some of those sustainability goals. Next, I want to talk about the middles. We typically manage weeds a little bit less intensively in the middles. That could be less frequent herbicides or using mowing or tillage or something like that. Uh, if you use herbicides in those middles, and I'm talking here other than a pre-harvest application. So in recent years, I've seen quite a few more orchards that use a year-round chemical program, and I would really recommend that you ask yourself whether that chemical management in the middles is really important to the system productivity, and could other approaches be used in those middles, either instead of or in addition to whatever chemical program is being used out there. I will say I know I'm contradicting myself a little bit here because I have presented some data in the past on chemical weed management in the middles, um, in the context of some specific weed problems. So, I'm not saying you should never use herbicides in the middles, but I think you should be really thoughtful about whether that's the best or only strategy. Think about what the goals are and what the problems you're trying to solve. And then lastly on this slide, thinking about scattered weed populations, is a full treatment on that strip or middle necessary, or is that something that a spot treatment or a limited area treatment could actually resolve without having to treat the whole strip or the whole orchard? So this isn't something I want to spend a lot of time on, but I'm just thinking of where we can make some changes to our chemical programs. And I kind of think about almond weed management in four general areas. In late winter or late fall, early winter rather, we often do some kind of post-harvest treatment. This is to get those early germinating weeds, around Thanksgiving or so, and then we're just trying to buy a month or two until the winter rains are more dependable. Once we get to December, January, this is where we do most of our heavy lifting for orchard weed or orchard herbicides. This is where our pre-emergent herbicide programs are really put into place because they get incorporated with rainfall. This is pre's. I've got a whole list there. You should see some familiar active ingredients, the Allions and Pindar GTs and Chateaus and Matrix and all of those. Oftentimes with one or more post herbicides to help with the existing vegetation. Then typically in late spring or late winter, early spring rather, we come in with a spring cleanup. That's oftentimes a strip treatment, although I am seeing a bit more middle sprays going on in this kind of March, April timeframe. And then in almonds, probably in June or so, we typically do a pre-harvest application. This would mostly be a full orchard floor treatment, getting, removing vegetation that could later interfere with harvest in mid and late summer. So where in this schedule could we reduce or change intensity? So I have the bullets here. The black parts of this are the ones I already talked about, but I've added the red portions here. So when we think about the products, really this comes back to weed ID. What weeds are there, and what's the best herbicide program to control the weeds that are in that orchard based on your scouting and your weed ID. What level of weed control is really necessary? I actually kind of said this already, but I think in many cases we're adding a treatment or a product to a mix to get that last, 0.1% or last very, very sparse weeds, and maybe that threshold could be relaxed a little bit with minimal or no impact on production, and probably benefit to the economics of the orchard system. In terms of rate, am I using the top rate because I need to, or because I'm thinking about it as an insurance policy? Um, you know, then I would also ask if you're using that product at the right time, because that's sometimes where I see failures, that we have a good program but we implement it poorly, or sometimes we have a poor program that we implement at the right time, and either way we end up with not quite acceptable weed control. In terms of the post herbicides, I do see herbicides and programs and mixes that are, quote unquote, heated up because the PCA or the grower really wants to do a good, guarantee a good job. And I think that sometimes is warranted, but in other times I'm not sure that it is. And so I would think, again, just be very truthful and thoughtful about what the goals are and what the best program is to achieve the goals, and then implement them as best you can. And then just on the rates, I think I already said this, but are there other products out there that could achieve the same level of weed control, but at a lower rate, if that is one of the levers that we think we can push from a sustainability standpoint? Now, I will say also, I've spent a lot of time over the last 10 years or so thinking about herbicide resistant weeds, and we do a lot of these herbicide mixes to manage existing resistant populations or to steward um, our resistance management programs as well. So that still needs to be part of our thought process. But I think there is some opportunity here to change kind of how we actually do that. Next, how frequently are herbicides applied in the orchards? So this is where I really I want you to think about designing good programs. So, this might be where that effective pre-emergent herbicide program could eliminate one or more post-emergent materials, which could really be, beneficial, or changing our expectations slightly and allowing a few plants to be out there, not doing an application to control a handful of weeds out in that orchard. Sprayed acres, I did the 9% example already, but another kind of back of the envelope calculation by my math, if we've got roughly 1.4 million acres of almonds in the state, if on average we reduce the strip width by 1 foot, that would reduce applications by about 60,000 acres per treated acres by 60,000 acres every application. Considering that we treat almonds, probably almond strips probably get 3 to maybe 4 applications per year. You could potentially reduce sprayed almond acres by 150, 200,000 acres just with that 1 foot narrowing of the strip. Recognizing there would be some of that would be made up with wider middles, but I think the strips get the bulk of the treatments, and a relatively minor change could have some significant aggregate effects across the industry. What about the middles? So I talked about weed tolerance already. Um, you know, Implementing mowing and tillage where it is feasible still makes sense. I think over recent decades we've gotten away from that, or utilize that less across the almond industry in favor of chemical programs. Those physical controls still are effective and can be used. To a certain extent, there might be opportunities to reduce rates out in those middles. Now, I think we got into some trouble with glyphosate resistance with sort of chemical mowing approaches decades ago. But I think I was thinking about this in terms of pre-emergent herbicides, particularly in drip irrigated orchards, where the middles aren't wetted after the springtime. A lower rate of a pre-herbicide might actually give you much longer duration of weed control than it would in a micro sprinkler irrigated or a solid set sprinkler irrigated field. So there might be some opportunity there. And then lastly on this slide, thinking about spot treatments, or perhaps even revisiting the smart sprayers. There was work years ago with the green seeker and weed seekers, and there's some interest in robotics and autonomous vehicles. And I think that might be something that we want to revisit in the almond production system as we move forward. Just thinking about whether the treatment is needed on the whole orchard floor. You see on the right, or on the left rather, there's a very low density weed pressure out there. Certainly it wouldn't be worth treating that whole walnut orchard to get that one ryegrass plant. That's where a guy with a shovel or a ATV sprayer, a spot sprayer, could take care of that problem. Middle photo, thinking about where the wetted area is. I've actually done some work in recent years, and we're trying to get back to this of thinking about camigation, or that same photo could be applicable to a spot sprayer or smart sprayer. If we could go through and just make a herbicide application where it's needed, where the weeds are, that would make sense. The right-hand photo is actually not an orchard photo at all, but thinking about weed mapping in a field, the idea there is maybe the weed pressure isn't the same across that whole field, and maybe just the north half of the field or the headlands need to be treated because that's where the weed pressure is greatest, and maybe a fractional treatment of that orchard would actually achieve the weed control goal without a whole orchard application. So a couple of comments about middles management. There's no one size fits all. Just like in the strips, there's no one size fits all program that'll work in every orchard every year. But I would say the year-round scorched earth, full 12-month chemical management programs, they do challenge the industry sustainability goals. They increase regulatory scrutiny, some challenges related to biodiversity and things that are, almonds are getting some pressure because of those scorched earth programs. We've got to do a certain amount of that for harvest because of our system, but I think to the extent it's possible that we can reduce that, it'll help us in aggregate. I think a lot of our orchard management thresholds are set too high. I think we have an unnecessarily high level of expectations for weed control in tree nut orchards, and I think just like the point above, that gets us into a little bit of regulatory and public scrutiny uh, trouble. Physical weed control still works. There are some hurdles with those operations, especially those that contribute to dust. But I think that should still be part of the one of the tools in our toolbox. And then when we talk about vegetation management, I'll just remind you that that doesn't necessarily mean 100% control. Managing is a different. We might be able to manipulate the vegetation in that orchard to help us achieve our goals, both economic, environmental, and production goals. And then just one last point about the middles. If your weed management goals and your scouting and your weed ID suggest that a chemical middles management program is important, just to be really, really thoughtful about why, and then think about how best to achieve that goal. This is especially important with some of the challenges we've got with our really late season applications of important post herbicides with public perception and also export markets. I'm thinking here specifically about glyphosate and glufosinate and paraquat, which all have different challenges, but challenges nonetheless. Couple of comments here about cover crops, but this could be weeds as well. Thinking about predictable and manageable vegetation. I want to use the middle photo here to think about strip width. For example, that Merced orchard had much wider spray strips, so you can see we got really poor cover crop establishment. And I think it's probably unnecessarily wide in terms of, they're going to come through and mow these middles. That cover crop middle is only about 2 feet wide, so having your 10-foot mower doesn't really, you haven't really saved a lot. So I'll leave you again with the questions I started with. What weeds do I have? Are they really problems? What is my tolerance? What are my control options? And can I reduce my intensity in some fashion while still meeting my weed management goals? And then last but not least, sometimes the bigger hammer isn't always the best solution. I think using the right tools appropriately is much better from our sustainability goals in the almond production system. And with that, I'll thank you for your time, and I hope we get to do this in person next year at the Almond Conference. Thank you.